Good afternoon, Britain. It's 23 minutes past 12, and we're to return now to that breaking story we covered yesterday. There's been a huge amount of reaction to it over the past 24 hours, that the sun is setting on the British Empire. Yes, the Chagos Islands are set to be handed back to Mauritius.
But the question today is, will other territories follow suit?
Sorry, I said back. They were never controlled by a sovereign Mauritius.
Can't make that mistake.
No, not handed back, handed over to Mauritius. Of course, they had been British, and before that they were French.
And the Chagos Islanders, who are living here in the UK, they don't seem too impressed by this all.
They hate Mauritius. Yeah. Mauritius was horrible to them.
Yeah, they're furious, actually. But yes, Argentina now have promised to reclaim the Falklands Islands. Apparently they have concrete action to do so. That's according to their foreign minister. So where is this all going? Where is this all going? Well,
we're delighted to be joined now by the Senior Fellow at the New Culture Forum, Dr. Philip Kiszely. Philip, there is a concern now about a domino effect on British territory that is overseas, British overseas territories. Is that something we should be concerned about?
Oh, yes, I think very much so. First of all, it's great to speak to you, Tom and Emily, again. I think let's just look at what's happening. This move, the Chagos move, has been framed in decolonisation language, but also military strategy. And what have we actually done? We've handed over a strategic position to China via Mauritius, you know. So as far as those two agendas are concerned, this is a complete catastrophe. But who would have thought there would be a domino effect? Answer: absolutely everybody, apart from, it seems, the British government. So this was always going to happen. The language that the Argentinians are using is extremely alarming, and this is just the first day. Falkland Islanders are waking up this morning and wondering, you know, what on earth their future is going to be. I mean, but we've got this Achilles heel, and it's our history. And let's be clear about this. Britain has been a great force for good in the world. Yes, we've not been perfect, but we have been a great force for good in the world. If anybody mentions colonialism, we just seem to kind of fall like a house of cards. But the language that Argentina are using, they're saying essentially that this was gifted to them by Spain, the colonial power Spain, in the 1800s. And so, of course, it's perfectly legitimate that they should own the Falkland Islands. So it's totally hypocritical. It's very, very frightening. And it's just indicative of the geopolitical posturing that's happening. And we just, with this government, we don't seem up to be able to deal with posturing.
It seems as though our governments, perhaps successive governments as well as this one, are sort of ashamed to act in the British national interest, that the wants of other people, for various reasons, and seem to trump our own. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I think that's precisely right, Emily, and I think that it just goes back to what I just said. It's about this Achilles heel about our own identity and our own history. We seem to not only loathe ourselves, we seem to be out to self-harm. This is playing out on the national stage, but you only have to look domestically to see exactly the same thing happening in all our institutions, in our education. And it comes back to this idea of we're educating people to hate themselves. So you can't expect all of that stuff to happen at home and then expect us to look after our own interests. And this is the really, really frightening. Expect us to look after our own interests abroad.
But Philip, why is this all in the language of colonialism when the Chagos Islands were uninhabited before being discovered by Europeans? The French then took control of them, and then Napoleon was defeated and we took control of them. That's the history of the Chagos Islands. There wasn't a native population there before Europeans came along. The Europeans were the first there. Similarly with the Falkland Islands. I mean, it's the same story. The Argentine claim, as you mentioned, relies on Spanish colonialism. It relies on a papal bull from 1493, when the Pope said this half of the world belongs to Spain and that half of the world belongs to Portugal. I mean, it's a fantastical nonsense. And yet, what seems to be the most curious thing here, Philip, is that the language of anti-colonialism is being used to defend colonialist claims.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it sums up the whole woke mind virus. And there's something at the heart of it. And again, I've talked about the alarming language, but there's something really insidious about the whole thing. And this is that we don't understand, one, our own history, but we don't understand the history of the world. Okay, so if you're out to completely defeat yourself and you can only think in broad terms of gender, race, sexuality, and that's the only thing you can think of, you kind of go back to the most obvious broad brushstroke ideology positions, and they don't stand up, you know, because ideology really has nothing to do with the minutiae of everyday development of political and cultural history and social history. Okay, it's like painting the Mona Lisa with a crayon. Okay, it's so stupid. But we don't have, and it comes back to education, we don't have the ability to stand up to this kind of thing, because people just tend to assume that people in power are right. And let's bear in mind who we're talking about here. We're talking about David Lammy, for God's sake, and we're talking about Keir Starmer. So I think it's time that we really understood ourselves, understood our position in the world, and stood up for ourselves. But I can't see that happening at any time soon.
Well, there you go. Dr. Philip Kiszely, thank you very much indeed for taking the time out of your afternoon to speak to us. You're from the New Culture Forum. Yes, I mean, using the language around decolonisation and imperialism to try and justify moves like this doesn't stack up, does it? It's more just about anti-British sentiment, isn't it? We're the worst people in the world, therefore any claim for something that we have control of must be legitimate.
I wouldn't be surprised if we think that sort of, you know, all these... I suppose we're dreadful Anglo-Saxons, aren't we? So we should probably hand back. We should probably hand back Northumbria, definitely Cornwall. I think. I mean, how far back do we want to go in terms of land that was previously invaded? Or maybe it works the other way around. Maybe we need compensation from Denmark for Danelaw, where they raided the entire east coast of England for a good 100 years or so.
Oh, it doesn't work that way, though, does it? We'll never get compensation.
No. I mean, we were brutally invaded by the Vikings, by the Normans, by the Romans. But I mean, we have no we can't say that we were. I mean, why is it so different?
Yes, and we're far too sensible to launch some kind of campaign for recuperation or reparations or whatever it is. Anyway, let us know what you make of it all. Yeah, it's pretty predictable, isn't it, that Argentina would decide to get in on the action. We're joined by Falklands war veteran Simon Weston to discuss this. Simon, it's hardly surprising now, after we've ceded the sovereignty of these Chagos Islands, that Argentina are piping up.
No, you mean once you allow somebody to roll their sleeves up and think that they can get into a fight, but when you look at Argentina, first and foremost, they don't have a military to concern anybody. They certainly don't have an air force or a navy to concern anybody because of underinvestment and the criminality and the filching of funds over there. But all of this nonsense is based on what geography? The geography of the Falkland Islands then would allow anybody to claim anything. But as we've seen that we've ceded ownership of the Chagos Islands and Diego Garcia in particular. But for what purpose? The geography of that is so far away from Mauritius, it doesn't make any sense. But then you can start saying almost any island that is claimed by anybody can be anybody's because they've made some sort of spurious claim. But what people got to remember is, and no, facts are most important here, the Argentinians weren't even a country when we claimed the islands. They were called the nation of states. They didn't have a colour, they didn't have a flag, they didn't have a government, they had nothing. And for them to claim something when we'd already claimed it, the only other people who occupied those islands before we went there were the French, and the French couldn't make it work. So 75% of the population of the Falkland Islands are from the same Scottish hill farming community that set the islands up. And they were the only people who could make it work. They've never had a claim on the islands. It's always been British. So where this claim comes from, we're over 600 miles from their coastline. That means anywhere can be claimed by anybody. And it's false. It's a false narrative. And anyway, why would we give a successful country that has a successful economy, it has almost no unemployment, it has no real problems, why would we hand that to a country that's rife with corruption and with all sorts of policing and political corruption? You know, why would we hand them over to them? The islanders, over 95% of the islanders, I think it was higher, 98, 99% of the islanders, voted to remain under British sovereignty. Now, surely their opinion counts more than any politician over here. I haven't heard Mr. Starmer say that he was even considering the sovereignty of the Falklands. He's not Mr. Corbyn, for instance, who had all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas that were just foolish beyond. But I've not heard Mr. Starmer say anything about that, and hopefully he never does. But then again, we didn't know there was a huge amount of negotiation going on about Diego Garcia. And if that's to make us safer, well, if we already owned it, how does it make us safer? It's like saying, this is my rifle, but I'll give it to you. You can own it, but I can have it every time I ask for it. You know, it's like, how does that make you safer?
Most people in this country will never set foot on the Falkland Islands. But I think most people feel an emotional connection to a part of the world that is proudly British, that flies our flag, that is under threat from a neighbour. There's almost an emotional connection there to the Falklands and to other British overseas territories as well. Clearly, you risked your life trying to keep that island free. Do you think that politicians in Whitehall, and civil servants for that matter, really understand that emotional connection that so many British people have with our overseas territories?
Oh, I'm fairly certain they understand it, but I think they resent it as well, because as we saw with the removal of the painting at 10 Downing Street of Baroness Thatcher, this was Britain's finest hour, and it was Baroness Thatcher's finest hour. And that is resented, without doubt, by so many people who disliked her immensely. So I'm fairly certain there's a smouldering of that type of resentment going on. So they would love to remove that from her legacy. But at the end of the day, what we have to look at is the islanders want to remain British. They want to remain under British sovereignty. Now, we gave them that option. They chose it. They had a referendum. We have to abide by the referendum. Like every referendum that takes place, we should abide by it. We're told it's a once-in-a-lifetime vote. You know, we've had them with Scotland, with Brexit and everything else. Once you have a once-in-a-lifetime vote, you can't keep going back to these things and renegotiating. We either stick by what we offer people, or what are we doing? We're betraying people's votes.
Well, absolutely. And the key point about the people of the Falkland Islands wanting to stay under British rule is a key one. And also with the Chagos Islands. They don't have a say.
Yeah, they don't like being handed over to Mauritius. That's treated them horribly in the past.
Don't want it. Simon Weston, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Falklands War veteran, of course. Now, we should say a Downing Street spokesperson has told us that, to be very clear on the Falklands, Chagos does not change our policy or approach to other overseas territories.
Well, there we go. They've said it. The politicians have said it. Must be true.